Hey folks, welcome to another video from aplaintruth.info and questioning everything to find truth. We're going to get into the great rock and roll hoax with the Doors, the Dead, and many others that was created as far as a account of the anti-war movement. How many knew that Jim Morrison's dad was part of naval intelligence in the Gulf of Tonkin lies that started the Vietnam War? Not many at all, but we're going to get into that. Morrison says the most important kind of freedom is to be what you really are. You trade in your reality for a role. You trade in your senses and act. You give up your ability to feel and in exchange put on a mask. There can't be any large-scale revolution until there's a personal revolution on an individual level. It's got to happen inside first, and that's what we're hoping bringing you today. So this is 3 books that base a lot of this from the strange but mostly true story of Laurel Canyon, the birth of the hippie generation by Dave McGowan. His life was taken for writing this book. It came very serendipitous. The book is titled Weird Scenes Inside Laurel Canyon, Inside the Canyon. It's a must read. Also, Sophia Smallstorm has a good podcast with the late, great Dave McGowan, who started this all through his investigation, and we'll find out how he was cancered and suicided as well. The other book I'm going to get into in the next part 2 is The Memoirs of Billy Shears. This is by Billy Shears, writing, who took over for Paul McCartney after he had his mind blown out in a car. He didn't notice that the lights had changed. All manufactured and written of the Beatles is written by the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations. Theodore Adorno was the man writing most of the Beatles songs. We'll get into that, as I said, and the Tavistock Institute in the next part 2. But Frank Zappa was another founding member of the Laurel Canyon. The illusion of freedom will continue as long as it's profitable to continue the illusion. At the point where the illusion becomes too expensive to maintain, they will just take down the scenery, pull back the curtains, move the tables and chairs out of the way, and you'll see a brick wall at the back of the theater. And there's the theater, him giving the Baphomet devil sign. Jim Morrison was demon-possessed, died at 27, along with many other rock and roll stars. Remembering that today in the War of Lies, they spent half a billion dollars just to promote the lies of Iraq and Afghanistan. Let's get into it. All right, so let's start with the book Weird Scenes Inside Laurel Canyon. And this was Dave McGowan's book. He was on vacation and got a book about Laurel Canyon, started reading about it. He was a criminal investigator, and he found so many anomalies, he's decided to investigate, and the investigation cost him his life. Here you can see Dave when he wrote this. Despite not having the healthiest diet and not making the most healthy lifestyles, I've been remarkably healthy throughout my adult life, but now literally overnight, that really has been replaced with a painful and, if I'm being perfectly honest, terrifying new reality. Based on what my doctors have told me and what I have read, the prognosis is not good. My oncologist seems to be of the opinion that I only have a couple years left on this planet, if that. And here's an interview he did. So this was sent to him on his website when he disclosed his book, and he was promoting it, about the strange scenes in Laurel Canyon and all the military background of all the rock and roll stars we know so well. So, quote, speaking of advice, this David McGowan fella really ought to quit smoking with all the elitist feathers he's ruffling. Notice this in all caps, folks. He's likely to come down with a spontaneous case of hitherto undiagnosed stage 4 inoperable pancreatic cancer. And that's what happened to him, folks. David is now passed. This is November 23rd, 2015. He had a horrendous last 8 hours, and he finally mercifully let it go at 12:42. We have just lost the greatest researcher of truth of our time. Let him never be forgotten. Amen. All right, so let's get into some of his work and some of his disclosures that cost him his life, folks. And please understand, this business is serious, serious business. And I don't take it lightly when I do this. And all you out there commenting and telling me I'm a shill or troll or whatever, or, taking sides or anything, I'm risking my life out here, folks, as well. I'm not, I'm publishing books and putting it out there. So don't tell me don't have skin in the game. When you start publishing your things and you want to send it to me to post because you think it's relevant and important and you got skin in the game, then you come talk to me. But all your comments that you're judging from the sidelines, unless you're in the game, you don't know what it's like. All right. So please stop the judgment, support me where you can. If not, just move on. I don't care. Just move on. I'm doing this from my heart and so that we all can move and understand the world a little better. All right. So this is from Mr. McGowan's book, May 8th, 2008. This is from a website that somebody, Center for an Informed America.com. That's mirrored his site because it was taken down. The old Crosby, Stills, Nash songs, there's something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear, but Mr. McGowan has brought it much clearer for us. It is the first week of August 1964, and U.S. warships under the command of U.S. Admiral George Stephen Morrison have allegedly come under attack while patrolling Vietnam's Tonkin Gulf. This event, subsequently dubbed the Tonkin Gulf Incident, will result in the immediate passing by Congress of obviously pre-drafted Tonkin Gulf resolution, which will, in turn, quickly lead to America's deep immersion into the bloody Vietnam quagmire. But it is well over 50,000 American bodies, along with literally millions of Southeast Asian bodies. Same thing in Iraq, folks. Millions have died for our lies. Will litter the battlefields of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. My sister-in-law lost her father in Laos as well during serving the war. It's personal. For the record, Tonkin Gulf incident appears to differ somewhat from the alleged provocations that have driven this country to war. This was not, as we have seen so many times before, a false flag operation. It was also not, as we've seen on more than one occasion, an attack that was quite deliberately provoked. No, what the Tonkin Gulf incident was, as it turns out, is an attack that never took place at all. The entire incident, as it has been all but officially acknowledged, was spun from whole cloth. It is quite possible, however, the intent was to provoke a defensive response. The ships in question were an intelligence mission and were operating in a decidedly provocative manner. It is quite possible when Vietnamese forces failed to respond as anticipated, Uncle Sam decided just to pretend it all happened. February 1965, the U.S., without a declaration of war, with no valid reason to wage one, began indiscriminately bombing North Vietnam. By March of the same year, the infamous Operation Rolling Thunder will have commenced. Over the course of the next 3.5 years, millions of tons of bombs, missiles, rockets, incendiary devices, and chemical warfare agents will be dumped on the people of Vietnam in what only can be described as one of the worst crimes against humanity ever perpetrated on this planet. Until today, where we're doing it again, but in much greater numbers, folks, because no one speaks out against the war anymore. We just war with everybody and kill everybody, and no one speaks out, except for guys like Dave McGowan, who had guts that cost him his life. Also in March 65, the first uninformed U.S. soldier will officially set foot in Vietnam. By April of 65, fully 25,000 uniformed American kids, most still teenagers, barely out of high school, will be slogging through the rice paddies. By the end of the year, the strength will be 200,000, almost 250,000. In the early months of 65, but a new scene is just beginning to take shape in Los Angeles. In Laurel Canyon, a heavily wooded, rustic, serene, yet vaguely ominous slice of L.A. nestled in the hills. Musicians, singers, and songwriters suddenly begin to gather as though summoned by some unseen Peter Piper. Within months, the hippie flower child movement will begin, giving birth there, along with new style of music that will provide the soundtrack for the tumultuous second half of the 60s. Now, why they brought this out was to counter the anti-war movement. Flower power. An uncanny number of music superstars will emerge from Laurel Canyon beginning in the 60s. What are the odds carrying through the decades? The first drop an album will be The Byrds, whose biggest star will be David Crosby. Mr. Tambourine Man will be released in the summer solstice of 65. They love their dates. It will quickly be followed by releases from John Phillips, Mamas and the Papas, and Frank Zappa, The Mothers of Invention, and Buffalo Springfield, featuring Steve Stills and Neil Young, including The Doors as well. One of the earliest of Laurel Canyon Sunset Strip is Jim Morrison. You recognize the name? The enigmatic lead singer of The Doors, he'll quickly become one of the most iconic, controversial, critically acclaimed, and influential figures to take up residence in Laurel Canyon. Curiously enough, though, the self-proclaimed Lizard King has another claim to fame. He is the son, as it turns out, of the aforementioned George Stephen Morrison, who helped to guide the false narrative of Gulf of Tonkin. What are the odds, folks? It gets better. Even while his father was actively conspiring to fabricate an incident, of an illegal war, the son is positioning himself to become an icon of the hippie anti-war crowd. Nothing unusual about that, I suppose. You know, a small world and all that, and it's not as if Jim Morrison's story is unique in any way. Then there's Frank Zappa, who comes in as well. Along with certain members, he has a sizable entourage in his log cabin. Nevertheless, Zappa, born careless enough on the winter solstice, never really made a secret that he had nothing but contempt for the hippie culture. Counterintelligence, control both sides of the narrative. In case you're wondering, Zappa was a chemical war. Let me back up here. Frank's dad was also little regard for the youth culture, given that Zappa was, in case you were wondering, a chemical warfare specialist assigned to where else? The Edgewood Arsenal. Edgewood is the longtime home of America's chemical warfare program. It's also deeply enmeshed in the MK Ultra operations. This is how long this stuff's been going on. The family later moved to Lancaster near Edwards Air Force Base, where Zappa continued to busy himself. Zappa's manager, by the way, is a shadow character, Herb Cohen, who had come out of L.A. from the Bronx, and his brother Mutt, who names his son Mutt, just before the music and club scene heating up. Cohen, a former U.S. Marine, had spent years traveling the world before his arrival in Laurel Canyon. Travels take him to Congo in 1961 at the very time the leftist minister Patrice Lumumba was being tortured and killed by our very own CIA. Oh, lovely. All right, Frank Zappa's wife, Gail Zappa, known formerly as Adelaide Slotman, hails from a long line of naval officers. She herself had once worked as the secretary for the Office of Naval Research and Development. Gail had attended a naval kindergarten with Mr. Joe Risen himself, Jim Morrison. What are the odds? The very same Jim Morrison later attended the same Alexandria CIA Virginia High School as the two other future Laurel Canyon luminaries, John Phillips and Cass Elliott, Mama Cass. Okay, so John Andrew Phillips was, shockingly enough, yet another child of military intelligence, the son of a U.S. Marine Corps Captain Claude Andrew Phillips, and a mother who claimed to have psychic and telekinetic powers. John attended a series of elite military prep schools in Washington, D.C., culminating in an appointment at the prestigious U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis. So John married Susie Adams, a descendant of John Adams. Susie's father, John Adams Jr., had been involved in what Susie described as cloak and dagger stuff with the Air Force in Vienna, unquote, or what we like to call covert intelligence operations. So it goes on about Phillips, captain in the military, during the 2 weeks that the Cuban Missile Crisis played out a few years after Castro took power. John Phillips found himself cooling his heels in Jacksonville, Florida, alongside, coincidentally, I'm sure, the Mayport Naval Station. Mr. Stephen Stills, Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, has the distinction of being a founding member of two of Laurel Canyon's most acclaimed and beloved bands, Buffalo Springfield and CSNY. For what it's worth, the opening lines that would appear at the top of this Bluebird, which coincidentally or not happens to be the original code name assigned to MK Ultra program. Stephen Stills, Jan, the product of yet another military family raised partly in Texas, young Stephen spent large swaths of his childhood in El Salvador, Costa Rica, and Panama Canal Zone, and various parts of Central America. As with the rest of his cast of characters, Stills was educated primarily at schools on military bases and elite military academies, among his contemporaries in Laurel Canyon. Stephen will later tell anyone who will sit and listen that he had served time for Uncle Sam in the jungles of Vietnam. All right, David Crosby, founding member of the seminal Laurel Band of the Byrds and CSNY, the son of an Annapolis graduate and World War II military intelligence officer, Major Floyd Delafield Crosby. Like others in this story, Floyd Crosby spent much of his post-service time traveling the world in places like Haiti, where he paid a visit in 1927. The country happened to be, coincidentally, under the military occupation of the U.S. Marines. One of the Marines doing the occupying was a guy earlier by the name of Captain Claude Andrew Phillips. Can't make this up. Crosby's much more just the son of Major Floyd Delafield Crosby. David Van Cortlandt Crosby, as it turns out, is a scion of the closely intertwined Van Cortlandt and Van Schuler and Van Riesener families. And while there's probably thinking the Who, you can plug it into Wikipedia and find out their background. This is old blue blood families. It also includes, I should hasten, for those who wish to taste for things more than a few high-ranking Masons. Stephen Van Rensselaer III, for example, served as Grand Master of the Masons for New York. And if that isn't impressive enough, according to New England Genealogical Society, David Van Cortlandt Crosby is also a direct descendant of Founding Fathers and Federalist Papers author Alexander Hamilton and John Jay. What are the odds? David Crosby is a bloodline member of that clan. How much more do you need? All right, Jackson, my eyes have seen Jackson Brown, I like Jackson Brown. Are you getting bored as I am? The product of a career military family. Doctor My Eyes, he wrote. Brown's father was assigned to post-war reconstruction work in Germany, which very likely means he was an employee of the OSS, which was the precursor of the CIA. U.S. involvement in post-war reconstruction in Germany largely consisted of maintaining as much of the Nazi infrastructure as possible while shielding war criminals from capture and prosecution. See Operation Paperclip. See also Operation Keyhole, where we let die millions, sent them back to Stalin for their deaths after World War II, and also detained enemy forces, where we rounded up all the Germans, over 1 million of them, and let them starve to death in concentration camps after the war. After the war, we let these people, old people, young people that couldn't fight the war, too poor, couldn't fight, and we let them just die in Germany. Fact. Against the backdrop, Jackson Brown was born in a military hospital in Heidelberg, Germany. Some 2 decades later, he emerged as, oh, never mind, as the band America with all 3 score hits. Ventura Highway, A Horse with No Name, and The Tin Man. I guess you probably don't need to hear that all 3 of these lads were products of military intelligence community. Beckley's dad was a commander of the now-defunct West Russellip U.S. Air Force near London. Bunnell and Peake's fathers were both career military officers serving under Beckley's dad at West Russellip, which is where the 3 boys first met. What are the odds? Mike Nesmith of the Monkees and Corey Wells of Three Dog Night were both arrived in L.A. not long after serving time with the U.S. Air Force. Nesmith also inherited a family fortune of $25 million. Graham Parsons, who would briefly replace Crosby and the Byrds before fronting the Flying Burrito Brothers, was a son of Major Cecil Ingram, also known as, quote, Coondog Connor II, a decorated military officer and bomber pilot who reportedly flew over 50 combat missions. You also might encounter some former mental patients such as James Taylor, who spent time in 2 different mental institutions in Massachusetts before hitting the Laurel Canyon scene as well. All right, and I'll include this book in my notes on it that I did in my blog, tabooblog.com as well. But I just wanted to go down to the part here. Jerry Brown, who's a Jesuit minister, who's the governor of California. What are the coincidences? Is also a longtime resident of Laurel Canyon, lived on Wonderland Avenue, not too many doors down from 8763 Wonderland Avenue, the site of the infamous 4 on the Floor murders. Also, the Charlie Manson murders were there as well, folks. You can't make this up. All right, so now let's turn our attention to the manufacturing of the deadhead. Sorry, all you deadheads, you're going to be not happy with what we're being presented here, but no problem because we're presenting just alternative narratives for you to consider. All right, so this is the work of Irvin and Atwell. When comparing the results of their research, Irvin and Atwell developed a theory about the origin of the psychedelic movement of the 60s, the counterculture. It has been developed by elements within the U.S. government and banking establishment as part of a larger plan to bring about a new dark age, or as it was marketed to potential victims, an archaic revival. Deadhead. Red, white, and blue. Notice that, folks. Human beings need to have a Godhead symbol, and public relations councils must help create them. Edward Bernays, father of propaganda. Please read his book, Propaganda from the 20s, hired by the Rockefellers to control minds way back then. And we spend billions and billions, look it up, on brain mapping in this country and other countries. They've been doing it for decades on brain mapping, studying what's between your ears, what's behind your eyes, billions of dollars a year. What do you think they know? All right, back to Dave McGowan, our hero, who lost his life for doing this. They learned from the connections of the military intelligence, and this was brought them to seek further. The father of the police band, Stuart Copeland, was the founder of the Office of Strategic Intelligence, the precursor to the CIA, who also co-founded the CIA. Ian Copeland, Stewart's brother, went on to start, quote, the new wave music movement, promoting bands such as his brothers, The Police, and also Squeeze, B-52s, The Cure, Simple Minds, English Beat, and the Go-Go's We Got the Beat. David McGowan also pointed out that Ian Copeland deliberately associated government power with the pop music counterculture by the names he gave his organizations: IRS Records, the police, and FBI Talent Agency. It's all mind control programming. Also, they got involved with the creation of the drug culture. So, in fact, a member of the CIA also been involved with the discovery of psilocybin mushrooms fit into a large collection of troubling linkages between the American government and the drug culture that emerged during the 60s. Irvin decided to do research further the psychedelic movement. Very few have been considered the possibility that the entire counterculture of that time, the whole hippie movement, was a social engineered plan to debase Americans' culture, as the name implies. The protests were gaining in the United States. The streets were being taken over by the people. The 19-year-olds males didn't want to go to war and die, since 20% of them or more were not coming back. So that's why they protested. So they had to come up with flower power and the hip and the love culture and all this we're getting into. So the author is compelling evidence that indicates that the psychedelic movement was deliberately created. The purpose of the plan was to establish a neo-feudalism by the debasing of the intellectual abilities of young people and to make them as easy to control as the serfs of the Dark Ages. One accurate term used for the individuals who were a victim of this debasing was deadhead, which is the equivocation for a dead mind or a drugged, thoughtless person. Just like we say hi to somebody, we say hello. Aldous Huxley predicted that drugs would one day become a human alternative to, quote, flogging for rulers wishing to control recalcitrant subjects. He wrote in the letter to his former student George Orwell in 1949. Remember, George Orwell was part of MI6. But now psychoanalysis is being combined with hypnosis, and hypnosis has been made easy and indefinitely extensible through the use of barbiturates and induced hypnoid and suggestible state in even the most recalcitrant subjects. Within the next generation, I believe the world's rulers will discover that the infant conditioning and narco-hypnosis are more efficient as instruments of government than clubs and prisons, and that the lust for power can be just as completely satisfied by suggesting people into loving their servitude as by flogging and kicking them into obedience. Lovely, Mr. Huxley. Decades later, one of CIA's own MKUltra researchers, Dr. Louis Jolin West, while citing Huxley, had this to say, quote, "The role of drugs in the exercise of political control is also coming under increasing discussion. Control can be through prohibition or supply. The total or even partial prohibition of drugs gives the government considerable leverage over other types of control. An example would be the selective application of drug laws permitting immediate search or no-knock entry, as we're seeing today, against selected components of the population, such as members of minority groups or political organizations. But a government could also supply drugs to help control a population. This method, foreseen by Aldous Huxley in Brave New World, has governed in the element employing drugs selectively to manipulate the governed in various ways. It's also notable that two individuals associated with the dead were once employees of CIA's MKUltra program and band members, lyricist Robert Hunter and author Ken Casey, whose merry pranksters were often at the Grateful Dead shows promoting LSD use to deadheads, and they traveled all around the country promoting it. Casey's novel One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest promoted the archaic revival by concluding with a heroic American Indian escaping from modern tyranny and returning to primitive culture. Grateful Dead songwriter John Barry Barlow in 2012 admitted in Forbes magazine interview ironically titled Why Spy that he spent time at CIA headquarters in Virginia at Langley headquarters, CIA. MKUltra ran a number of its operations through Haight-Ashbury. How many knew that? The San Francisco district where LSD would become commonly used. And the factories for the LSD was down in LA, and there's information on that, but I'll bring that up later. Declassified CIA records show that there were at least 3 CIA safe houses in the Bay Area where experiments that were giving LSD to unsuspecting citizens went on. This sub-project of MKUltra was named Operation Midnight Climax. Chief among Operation Midnight Climax safe houses was at 1225 Chestnut and Telegraph, which operated from 1955 to 1965. MKUltra was involved in bringing about New Age quasi-religious movement, which debased the reasoning of anyone who succumbed to the philosophies. Another progenitor progenitor of this movement, which believes in channeling and other fictional elements, was the book A Course in Miracles, written by two MK Ultra employers, William Thetford and Helen Schuchman. All right, so the Grateful Dead was promoting LSD in San Francisco, another music counterculture scene with many suspicious connections to military intelligence, began promoting the young people attending music clubs in the Sunset Strip. And then there's Woodstock. The counterculture of Woodstock had been presented as accidental. No, it wasn't. The string of occurrences led to the publication of Life magazine's cover story about Gordon Wasson's experience upon taking the psilocybin mushroom. Irvin has shown, however, in his paper, Gordon Wasson, the Man, the Legend, the Myth, that there were too many contradictions in the storyline to it to have been a chance meeting with the editors of Life, or Luce's, Knights of Malta, Luce's publication, Life magazine. Henry Luce, L-U-C-E. Wasson's direct boss at J.P. Morgan was Henry P. Davison. Davison was a senior partner and generally regarded as Morgan's personal emissary. Davison, who essentially created, or at least funded, the Time Life magazine for J.P. Morgan in 1923. After a row with Henry Luce for publishing an article against the war for Britain, he became the company's first investor in Time magazine and company director. Another partner, David Moreau, helped finance the Time Life startup. Luce, in charge with his company as president, were both members of Yale's Skull and Bone Society, also Knights of Malta, from 1920. Davis and Luce then made C.D. Jackson, former head of U.S. Psychological Warfare, vice president of Time Life. Another Skull and Bones establishment was Britton Hayden, who worked with Davis, Luce, and Morrow. Hayden was initiated in Skull and Bones, and it goes on and on. Averil Harriman, who was the ambassador to Russia, all connected. After Wasson's article was published, many people sought out mushrooms and the other big hallucinogens of the day. In 1958, founder Luce and his wife Claire Booth Luce dropped acid with a psychiatrist. Luce conducted an imaginary symphony during this trip. The most important person to discover drugs through the life piece was Timothy Leary himself, another CIA operative, which developed the tune in, turn on, and drop out that would abandon modern culture and return to a status of a peasant. It doesn't matter, folks. Just tune in, turn out, take drugs, and drop out. And successfully, they've countered the anti-war movement. Now we don't even have an anti-war movement. That's how successful these guys have been. Marketing and PR expert Marshall McLuhan, who had an influential on the Leary and later at McKenna, is one of the actual developed the expression tune in, turn on, and drop out. All right, so among the key members of the Freudian psychoanalyst movement in England, most of whom were associated with the Tavistock Institute, which we'll get into next about the Beatles, were Gustave Le Bon, the originator of the term crowd psychology. Bernays refers to all these theorists and crowd controls in his writing. Crowds are somewhat like the Sphinx of ancient fable. It is necessary to arrive at a solution to the problems offered by their psychology, or to resign ourselves to being devoured by them. In a 1980 interview in Playboy magazine, John Lennon claimed that the military and CIA created LSD. Through this did not stop him from encouraging its use. We must always remember to thank CIA and the Army for LSD. That's what people forget. Everything is the opposite of what it is. Isn't it, Harry? Harry Luce. So get out the bottle, boy, and relax. They invented LSD to control people, and what they did was to give us freedom. In light of the discovery, the CIA funded George Wasson's trip to Mexico. Lennon's comments begs the question as how he came to this understanding about the CIA popularizing LSD, and raises additional questions about his assassination, no doubt. All right, and here we've got another article I'm going to do on the Beatles and the Tavistock Institute, and all their music was made by the Tavistock Institute, one Theodore Adorno, and the counterculture was the Dark Side, the Rolling Stones painted black sympathy for the devil, the good boys, the bad boys. We'll get into it next. But what I want to bring your attention to for staying on the dead, interesting to note, the Tavistock Institute, a human rights child organization, the Stanford Research Institute, or SRI, developed the Grateful Dead, among other things. Alan Trist, a social engineer for the Tavistock Institute, became the shadow manager of the Dead. His father, Eric Trist, was one of the principal founding members of Tavistock. It was part of the development of dynamic psychological warfare model to be used on foreign and domestic populations, modeled ultimately on the Lord Gordon riots in London and the Jacobin terror of the French Revolution. The purpose was to mobilize mobs in an ideological opposition to the state as a mass destabilizing operation. A mass destabilizing operation. So Garcia and all promoted the acid test, tune on, tune out, tune out. What was the real order? You suddenly find yourself in a new space with new form, more like the flow. To put Garcia's formulation in terms of contemporary Silicon venture capitalists might understand, LSD was a disruptive technology, and except that instead of upending mere transactions such as hailing a cab or renting a hotel, the things being disrupted were the basic conventions of society, which is why mainstream America was and remains so terrified of the drug. So the Dead's handlers, August Owsley Stanley. Owsley. He was a key figure in the San Francisco Bay Area hippie movement during the 60s and played a pivotal role in the counterculture. Under the professional name Bear, he was the sound man for the rock band The Grateful Dead, where he met Ken Casey, invited them to the acid test party. As their sound engineer, Stanley frequently recorded live tapes behind the mixing board and developed their wall of sound system, one of the largest mobile public address systems ever constructed. Stanley also designed the band's trademark skull logo. Who knew that? Stanley was the first private individual to manufacture mass quantities of LSD, working for the CIA. By his own account, Stanley produced 500 grams, amounting to a little more than 5 million doses at a time, so everybody could tune in and tune out. He was the son of a political family from Kentucky. His father was a government attorney. His grandfather, A. Owsley Stanley, a member of the United States Senate after serving as governor of Kentucky and U.S. House of Representatives. At an early age, he committed himself to St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C., studying engineering at University of Virginia before dropping out. When he was 21, he enlisted in, here we go, the U.S. Air Force and served for 18 months before being discharged. Became known as Owsley's Acid as he provided it for everybody. Stanley met the members of the Dead during 1965. He financed them, folks. He financed them and worked with them as their first sound man. Where did he get his money from? During this time as sound engineer for the Grateful Dead, let me move this over. Stanley started what became a long-term practice recording the Dead while they rehearsed and performed. His initial motivation for creating what he dubbed as the Sonic Journal was to improve his ability to mix the sound, but the fortuitous result was an extensive trove of recordings from the heyday of San Francisco concert dance scene in the mid-'60s, no doubt. And here we see, this is from a New York Times article here. We can see about Mr. Owsley Stanley remained with the band on and off through the 70s, when according to Rolling Stone, too much even for the Grateful Dead, they parted company. His other clients included John Lennon, who, according to the Beatles' biography, contracted to pay Mr. Stanley for a lifetime supply of his wares. It's all connected. So just following real quick how far this goes back, this is the grandfather, Augustus Owsley Stanley. He assumed an anti-prohibition stance. Now, why this is important in 1914, while he was a member of the House of Representatives, is another false narrative, false story, is the anti-prohibition. Prohibition was not created because people were drinking too much. It was created because Henry Ford would not play ball with Rockefeller. Henry Ford's new Model A's that came out, the first editions, had a switch that could run on switchgrass and on hemp oil. His idea was that the farmers across the country would benefit, where people could drive their cars cross country, make their own alcohol gas, and drive cross country supporting farmers and buying their food. Rockefeller wanted to sell his fuel, his Standard Oil fuel, so he created the Prohibition along with Joe Kennedy. And if I look further, I'd no doubt see an association between Mr. Stanley and the Rockefellers and the Kennedys as well. And then here we go, the Christian connection, father, the minister, disciples of Christ, Christian college, blah, blah, and blah. All right, wrapping it up here since we're getting past 30 minutes and I don't want to take too much of your time. We'll get into the whole Laurel Canyon Lookout Mountain nuclear bomb hoax photography studio, also the making of the fake Apollo missions as well. Lookout Mountain was right above Laurel Canyon, established as a secret film unit. Air Force Base Station covert studio closes after the world's nuclear powers all agree to move testing underground. They finished their work. Jay Leto, born in Louisiana, worked for Echelon Global Surveillance Intelligence Corporation run by the U.S. 1971 is born. Leto lends his breakout role. This is the guy that bought Lookout Mountain. A firm called 180 Center leases Lookout Mountain and turns it into an extensive rehab center, charging $50,000 a month. 180 shuts down after Hollywood Reporter reveals questionable activity, including the death of 2 residences as well. Weird scenes in Laurel Canyon as well. So we can see the nuclear bomb facility compound in Laurel Canyon. As I said, we'll get into this more later, but there's a lot of pictures that confirm and show this secret facility that was used as a nuclear film studio to fake the nuke bombs. Wonderland Avenue in Hollywood Hills, United States Air Force established Lookout Mountain in 1947, as we said. During its 22 years of operation, Lookout Mountain produced approximately 6,500 classified films for the Department of Defense and the Atomic Energy Commission, documenting nuclear tests, fake tests, Operation Greenhouse, Operation Teapot, Operation Buster Jangle. The compound since converted an 8-bedroom, 12-bathrooms, and sold to that guy Jared Leto for $5 million. And here's an old picture from it. And as you can see here, Russia has an A-bomb as they practice the propaganda. And for those of you that think nuclear weapons exist, I need you to think again and do your research here. I'll include these in the show notes. But again, we're being told a bunch of massive lies. You can look at the Nuclear Scare Scam by Galen Windsor. And when you watch this, he is actually eating, I don't know if it's plutonium or uranium, to show it is not hazardous. We've been worked again. All right, so that's all I got for now. I'm going to get into the Beatles and the Tavistock Institute in the next video so we can get clear on this whole rock and roll hoax has been perped on us for mind control and social engineering. I hope this has made it clear. Plain truth. Time to go outside in nature and have some daytime. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you on the next video. Plain truth out. Rock and roll is here to stay. Love will never die. Peace out. Love will find a way.